Hello, my name is Anthony Amato. I'm the author of the Stark Carpathians. The Stark Carpathians looks at ritual, texts, and authority among the Hutsuls of Ukraine. You might ask, well, what are these things, ritual, text, and authority? Well, ritual is a repeated action with symbolic content, and we might also describe ritual as transformative. And these rituals are everyday rituals, but they also are once in a lifetime rituals. And some rituals are linked to calendar as well, the important yearly calendar. That is ritual. I'll talk about ritual probably a little more during this interview. The other issue is, well, what are texts? Texts in this case are understood very broadly, ranging from sermons given by local clergy to folk songs to popular chapbooks that were in circulation 125 years ago. And the last term I want to define is authority. Authority is the right to have say over something. Authority can be synonymous with power. Authority was most often identified with civil officials and also church officials. And in some cases, villagers had authority invested in their role as part of village groups or as part of households. So those are the three key things that I'm looking into in this book. They are the themes of this book. It's a whole different way to look at life in this small area of the Carpathian Mountains. I should say a few words about the title people. The Hutsuls are just one small group of Ukrainian Highlanders, and they have lived in the far southwestern tip of Ukraine for the past um, 10 centuries, with waves of people going farther and farther into the mountains over the last few centuries. They're a very small group. The name has external origins, and it wasn't always a name that the inhabitants of the area liked to use. These Greek Catholic, Ukrainian speaking peasants initially regarded the name with some um, suspicion, and then later came to regard the name as a slur. And but yet today the name has turned into a term that brings people together. One thing that I will say is that my book stops in 1939. It is a history, an investigation of the past. It is informed by present day life in the region, but it is primarily focused on a past period from the abolition of manorial obligations in 1848 all the way to 1939 and the great disjuncture that came in 1939, the incorporation of this area into the Soviet Union after the outbreak of the Second World War. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that a lot of people have sort of skipped over without investing much thought into identities. One term that they used was actually Christian. They described themselves as Christians of the Ruthenian faith. That was a very common way that they identified themselves because they knew of other faiths, and they used this term Christian to identify themselves. One of the greatest lines that the ethnographer in the past stumbled upon was a vampire can kill a Christian. In other words, meaning a vampire can kill um, any regular person like us of the Greek Catholic faith. Another term that they used was Rusyn, but that was fairly rare, that is best translated probably in English as Ruthenian. And ultimately, over time, they came to use this term Ukrainian. After the year 1900, the term became more and more common. Another important thing about what the Hutsuls called themselves is they often referred to themselves as chlop. Now that means peasant, bonded peasant. And that term was used very, very commonly when they wanted to oppose themselves to the gentlemen, the pane in their lives. And those people who were gentlemen were either people of landed status or just fancy outsiders who lived in the region. Thank you for raising that question. They are separate from the Lemkos. The Lemkos were much more agricultural. Also, at the end of the 19th century, Lemkos really immigrated out of Galicia as the Hutsuls did not. The Lemkos, of course, spoke very differently than the Hutsuls, very different dialect. And Boykos were a group that was closer to the Hutsuls, bordered the Hutsuls, and they actually had more land under cultivation than the Hutsuls did. And the Boykos and Lemkos, in a sense, had names that did not cross the Carpathian Mountains southward or westward. Those particular designations were only used by people north and east of the mountains, whereas the term Hutsul crossed the mountains, crossed the Carpathian Mountains into Transcarpathia and into parts of present-day Romania. The last term that you touched on is probably the newest term, Carpatho-Rusyn. It is a term that is used by many people in North America and in parts of East Central Europe as an identity. Hutsuls were often using the term Rusyn to identify themselves and Ruski to identify themselves. But really, in the past few decades, the term Carpatho-Rusyn has not caught on among the Hutsuls who live in the Transcarpathian Oblast. That's the district of Ukraine that is farthest to the southwest in today's Ukraine. And those who live in what was Galicia, just across the mountains, these Hutsuls don't use the term Carpatho-Rusyn as an identity. All Hutsuls use the term Ruthenian, Rusyn at one point or another, because it was a legal term, both in Poland, interwar Poland, and in interwar Czechoslovakia. And so all of those terms are very important. I focus just on a small group of Hutsuls who live in Galicia, but my interest in Hutsuls and in the Carpathian Mountains extends far beyond just this small area. Another thing to keep in mind is that those names like Lemko and Boyko, and also even other names for the people who lived in the mountains, those really were started and popularized by outsiders. And then only later did they catch on among mountaineers themselves. Many people think that if they have a heritage in the Carpathian Mountains and it's an Eastern Rite heritage, in other words, the Greek Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, they have to be one of those three. They have to be a Lemko, they have to be a Boyko or a Hutsul. That is not necessarily the case. There are a number of cases where people don't use those regional terms for themselves. So the Lemkos lived in what today is the far southeastern corner of Poland. A few still live there. Boykos live in Ukraine, just to the southeast of the Lemkos, and the Hutsuls actually live to the southeast of the Boykos. That's an excellent question, and that is an interesting way of formulating one of the distinctions that might be included in Carpatho-Rusin identity. Now, in the case of the Hutsuls actually migrated to the Transcarpathian side, to the Hungarian or Czechoslovak side of the mountains, really late. So, probably in the 18th century and very early 19th century is when we have documents. So the Hutsuls were coming from the foothills and lowlands of the northeastern side of the mountains. And in their case, in terms of language and in terms of behavior, there wasn't a lot that separated them from people in Piedmont towns or around Piedmont towns like Kolomea or Stanislaviv. That's the town that is Ivano-Frankivsk today. There is a lot of Central European heritage among Hutsuls, such as references to Franz Joseph. There also is a great deal of identity with the Austrian period in history and with Galicia. And these are kind of key features. Now, right is incredibly important for Hutsuls. The whole notion of many people's identity comes from right, either Orthodox or Greek Catholic. And the language of that right, it was written in Cyrillic letters. So though these people came to really focus on themselves and understand themselves through ritual, and their early efforts at literacy were in the Cyrillic alphabet. There are some cases where individuals used Latin letters, but really, in a sense, they were connected to a world that was Eastern oriented. This was not a grand East in a scheme of a clash of values, but it was a small East in terms of the calendar, the letters used, and the church ritual. These things were foundational in early 20th century Hutsul life. I was interested in the Carpathian Mountains, and I began to take an interest a long time ago in the Hutsuls as the group that was most isolated and had the least amount of land under cultivation. They lived primarily through trading for grain, and the products they traded for grain were either forestry products or they were the products of pastoralism, primarily raising sheep. So that inspired me to write, to pick the topic. And as I got deeper and deeper into the topic, I discovered there were endless facets of life that I could take into account. Just by looking at this small group, I really didn't discover the world in a teacup, but I discovered endless threads kind of leading out of a little ball of yarn. Well, some of the earliest sources I consulted did not originate with Hutsuls. They originated with the authority figures above them, civil authorities and also clergy. One example of clerical writing is just a cleric's year-by-year chronology of his life in his parish, very short entries. The Hutsul's own texts actually come in a little later. Many people, fueled by 19th century Romanticism, feel that they are compelled to gather the creations of the folk. And in other words, the people, the common people. And so these people seek out the music and they seek out the stories and poems of these isolated people. And they celebrate these things. And these things make great sources. Uh, on the surface, they just seem to be kind of antiquated and stereotypical, but if you begin to read how these texts are decorated, um, you can come into a world that otherwise wouldn't be available. It's a world of authority. So, looking at folk songs, looking at all kinds of different folklore that is collected, like proverbs. And this gets richer and richer as the 19th century passes because more and more people get to the Carpathians and start collecting. And this collection is a key process in the region. It gives us access to a lot of sources that might have been missed. A good, yes, that aspect is there. Obviously, there's a pre-Christian past that is incredibly important in ritual, particularly the rituals of calendar. And the rituals of calendar actually um, are quite ancient and universal, and they go back to the early Christian church, not the Christianization of Rus or anything like that, but the early Christian church was seeking to often co-opt celebrations and rituals. So it tied itself to the existing calendar. Now, as time passes, the influence of Christianity becomes more and more important. And this Christianity is mixed in with all kinds of local practices that don't necessarily have really old roots, pre-Christian roots. Rather, they are on the spot improvisations that really find supporters and find practitioners. In a sense, if we look at the um, central Hutsul holiday, Christmas, it's a holiday with many rituals associated with it. Some of the rituals obviously predate Christianity, such as Christmas caroling. Other rituals are inspired by people's responses to the church and its scripture, its words. Now, if we look at the second most important Hutsul holiday, Easter, we can also see a lot of pre-Christian components, but we also see many improvisations and we see a number of official rituals that people take into their lives and use to enrich their understanding of the world. They're able to invest occasions and situations with different sets of meanings. I did find something that was quite surprising in working on this book. Initially, I expected to find a lot of court cases that would document disputes. I also expected to find much more of a pre-Christian component. But as I think Christine Worobec, that I might be mispronouncing the name or
That's correct.
anglicizing the name, but Worobec stressed is that the peasants thought that they were Christian. And this is very important because a lot of what was happening in these remote, isolated mountains was really related to the church and Christianity. There was an enormous component of the pre-Christian in life. But what I was shocked by was all of the things that I discovered that had Christian roots, and also even if they weren't Christianity according to official definitions, they became part of a vernacular or popular Christianity practiced in the region, such as making the sign of the cross as a protective gesture. Uh, just the universality of that sign and its ubiquitousness in daily life was incredibly important for Hutsuls. And so that's what I was, really shocked by over time. Another thing that I didn't expect to discover is that I didn't expect to discover the influence of civil and religious authorities in the isolated mountains. I expected there to be more or less an absence of these authorities, but even though the authorities were distant from people's lives, people sought them out to um, enforce their own authority in daily life. So those are two things that shocked me, and the way that these things were woven into the words, and how even though there might be a lack of official documents, there might also be a set of words that were passed down generation to generation that alluded to a whole set of authorities that um, were thought to be relatively absent from the life in these isolated mountain villages. Right at the beginning of the book, I describe the economic and environmental realities of the region. Without the economic and environmental realities of the region, the reader would have a hard time understanding life. The next two chapters venture into the world of religion. First of all, the Greek Catholic Church was an important authority in people's life. And as such, it needs to be investigated. What was happening among clergy actually became very important for what was going on in parishes. And popular or vernacular faith was really shaped by the authority of the clergy. After that, I advance into reading. Literacy got off to a late start in the region, and most people in the region 125 years ago were illiterate, but there were different conduits by which the knowledge of the literate world came into daily life. And over time, more and more people acquired an instrumental literacy that enabled them to pick out material that entertained them, to pick out material that was useful to them. So that shaped life. And thereafter, I proceed into a chapter that addresses an episode around cultivation, clergy, and parishioners, and the discussions that they had, as well as astrology. Astrology was fairly important um, in daily life. It did not really have pre-Christian origins. It came to people over time, orally through over the course of the centuries, and many people were deeply confused about the meaning of the stars in daily life and this um, notion of astrology. Similarly, with medicinal practices, many people were deeply confused about what was the proper cure for this condition. As time passed, more and more people began to really um, move toward um, understanding cures um, through what was read or had been written, but they were great skeptics of this. The next few chapters move into politics, which was very personal and very local. Corruption proved to be a persistent force in politics, but also around the year 1900, there was an enormous mobilization of people in the region, in that isolated region, and they were joining parties and having opinions about politics in ways they had not had opinions before. These opinions were not necessarily opinions that had been introduced to the region from above, but they were rather responses to all of the turmoil that was occurring around 1900 in Austrian Galicia and in the larger world. The next few chapters deal with stories about witches and vampires, how to understand these stories, and how to get a lot out of these stories, how these stories offer insight into many aspects of village life. The last three chapters are on rituals. One chapter is on Christmas caroling. Another chapter is on the games played at wakes associated with funerals. And then the last chapter is on a holiday called Wet Monday, Easter Monday, a water splashing affair. And all of these rituals created great controversy. Great controversy. This was controversy that brought in clergy. It also brought in villagers and set individual villagers against one another. First of all, I discovered the need to know many languages and always know more languages. The people actually lived in a multilingual environment. German was the official imperial dialect, but Polish was the language of administration, and then also an official language in Galicia for a long time. And then, of course, Polish was the language of interwar Poland. And then finally, there was the local speech. And this local speech is important because the local speech was not Church Slavonic. Um, it was not the Ukrainian that is the basis for contemporary standard Ukrainian today, and it certainly wasn't Russian. The work with primary sources involves is navigating many languages and then also working with different registers of language and different local variations of language. Um, really getting into primary sources was made possible by ethnographers who compiled many sources as they were spoken. And working through those sources involves working with a variety of dictionaries and even a variety of people who can be consulted as to what did that mean, or is there some type of wordplay there that's incredibly important. And then I should also mention about the topic of language. In the book, I take a line that is often used in North America, and the line is, the past is a foreign country in a foreign language. And they use that to generally describe the past. If a U.S. historian is studying the United States, that historian might say the past is a foreign country in a foreign language. In the case of the Hutsuls, that literally is the case because not only are their own words in a language that is very foreign, but foreign languages play a role in their lives, and they know about these foreign languages, and they borrow from these foreign languages copiously. They are borrowers really before they can even read. They're borrowing tremendously from foreign languages. They're borrowing words and phrases, localizing these phrases, and really creating a world of words. That's why, in a sense, this project depends a lot on published sources as opposed to archives, because archives kept records in the official languages, but often what I'm interested in is the local language used, local speech, and the power of this speech, and the power of idioms in this speech, idioms that often can't be recognized easily. Um, and so the language plays an enormous role. Primary sources play an enormous role. The collections of ethnographers play an enormous role too, as well. Outside of history, there is a lot of activity in the field of folklore, anthropology, and also in a field called cultural studies and geography as well, cultural geography. But within history, the cultural turn in history has sort of turned away from microhistory. Even though many people talk about microhistory these days, the cultural turn has turned away from microhistory and rural history. So I have had to really look a lot at these other fields and, and their approaches. Now, local history is something that is always changing, and a wave of interest in local history really came over late Soviet Ukraine and early independent Ukraine. And that local history has done a lot for knowledge of the Hutsul region. It's uncovered new sources for us to use, and we really have to celebrate that local history. Unfortunately, unfortunately for all of the peoples of the Carpathian Mountains and even adjacent lowland areas, there's not enough local history, and there's not enough local history that is really inspired by anthropology, folklore, cultural geography, and cultural studies. I, though, think that in several decades that will no longer be the case. This is a case where I'm quite optimistic. So I think that, in my own research, I read widely, comparatively. And so for me, that is very important, um, putting all of this in a comparative framework. There are limits, of course, to the comparative framework because sometimes there is nothing to compare. There's just a nothing there. And then how do you compare nothing to something? And this is part of the great challenge of local history. It's part of the great challenge that people face when they want to work in an area of the world that is understudied. And I consider this area still understudied. Not because many people are working on it, but because there is a lot for people to do. First of all, about ritual. Ritual was very important in defining Hutsuls, both Greek Catholic ritual, which Hutsuls differentiated from Orthodox ritual, and certainly from Roman Catholic ritual. They understood their practices as distinct from those around them and those far from them that they heard about. Ritual also was important to Hutsuls because there were important Hutsul holidays such as Rahman Easter, which is celebrated after Easter. The celebration of that Easter brought Hutsuls together and separated them from many other surrounding Greek Catholics. So ritual is quite important in many people's lives. It can be formal ritual, it can be informal ritual. Ritual is symbolic, it's repeated, and it is transformative. Of course, it changes over time, and the changes were one of the things that I was quite interested in. Texts, as I mentioned, came in many forms in the Hutsul region, from folk songs to lengthy oral narrations to ghost stories to riddles. These things were very important. Some of their content was really influenced by um, the popular press and popular belief among literate people in the past. Astrology is a good example of this. Astrology actually came to the region and showed up in its folk songs and stories um, after it had been imported to the region by hearsay. Now, I want to talk a little about authority, because authority um, is a neglected aspect of the Hutsuls and their world. The authority within households was important, but in addition to that, the authority of religious figures and also civil figures was very important in forming identities for these people. They lived in isolation, but they weren't isolated from the power mechanisms that governed three separate states. What three separate states are we talking about? We're talking about Austria-Hungary. We're talking about the Second Republic, Poland, between the two world wars, and we're talking about finally the Soviet Union. This is a historical work, so it doesn't come to present day Ukraine. Now, in terms of why this might matter and why this might be important, um, the notion of authority is who has the right to speak about what and how can they speak? How are conflicts resolved? These things are very important. What is the true text? What is the way it should be? These are all questions of authority. The final point I'll make, and this is an important point about my work, is my work stops in 1939. And in a certain way, this work should and could be taken up, or could and should be taken up by someone to bring it up closer to the present. The past informs the present, and often in terms of the past, we have to look at the present to fully put it into context. So um, these are important foundations of my book and in general of my approach to history. I'm presently working on an economic history of the Hutsul region to complete what could be called a trilogy. And this economic history is very hardcore economic history with quantification, looking at the economic questions of life. My first book covered the environment. This second book covered culture, and I hope this third book can cover economics well. I am also interested in the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that a completely separate work. And this work is assessing the late Soviet economy and the issue of collapse. And so that's what I'm working on right now. And I really appreciate this opportunity. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, have a good day. Take care.
You too. Bye bye.